Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your time that you've spent here in Cincinnati. We hope you all come back. You found it enjoyable and find a way to come back and visit us. Our club is always open to you, so remember that. Today I have the honor of introducing an outstanding attorney, a community leader, a fellow Rotarian, and a friend, Rob Bilott. Rob received his undergraduate degree from New College of Florida, and he got his law degree from The Ohio State University. In 1990, he joined the law firm Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister, now sometimes referred to as Taft Law. Taft was founded by the sons of William Howard Taft, President William Howard Taft, back in 1923. So it's been here a long time, but it even goes back a little deeper than that, back to 85, because the Taft attorneys acquired another firm that existed in 1885. So it has been around for a while. Some of you may know or heard of the Taft-Hartley Act. Taft was the one, the Taft law firm was the one who participated in that. Two of the employees and attorneys of Taft were also senators, so it has a long political stature, both Robert Taft Jr. and Robert Taft III. But Rob isn't a political figure, not at all. Yet he has made a difference. He's made a difference to all of us, certainly made a difference within his law firm. And the good thing about it is Rob is, he never has been political at all. He's always been straightforward. He subscribes to the Rotary ideals. There's no question about that. Rob in 1998 accepted an assignment, and after much thought, to serve a small farmer down in Parkersburg, West Virginia, a farmer that his grandmother knew. So there was a lot of pressure there because he loved his grandmother and spent quite a bit of time down in Parkersburg with her. Little did he know that what he thought was a case would become a journey, and still continues. During that time, Rob was raised the awareness of the environmental regulators with regard to what are called forever chemicals. And some of you say, well, I don't know what a forever chemical is. All of us, it's touched every one of us in this room. Everyone, not just some of us, all of us. Things as simple as Teflon. So, all of us have been impacted by it, but it's called PFAS, P-F-A-S, which is just a shortened form of the chemicals that are impacted. His work has actually resulted in regulations which have been formed or are being formed right now as a part of a much larger effort to deal with the issue and to decontaminate some of these areas. Rob is a speaker in great demand, and we're thankful that he agreed to speak with us today. He's been recognized by the International Right Livelihood Award, which is the alternate to the Nobel Peace Prize. So it's an international award, very, very distinguished. His book, entitled Exposure, Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's 20-Year Battle Against DuPont, is also very well read and is a good read for any of you, so you can certainly pick that up. The case in Rob's work also spawned a movie called Dark Waters. And if you haven't seen that, that's one you have to see. You just got to see it. It's unbelievable. When you hear the story today, Rob is a humble man. You're not gonna get the gist of what he did, what he had to do, until you see that movie. So when you see that movie, coupled with the fact that you met him, I think it'll all come together for you. And actually, Rob created an opportunity, in addition to himself being in that movie, along with Mark Ruffalo and Anne Hathaway. He also created an opportunity for 4 of our Rotarians from our club in Cincinnati to have a part. So in case you didn't know, Bob McElroy, some of you know him because he drove you around. Bob Miller, Brian Miller, and Owen Rassman were all in that movie. So that was kind of special in itself. Also, there's a documentary entitled The Devil We Know, and that's been on public television, probably re-air at some point in time. And then also, Rob received the Legacy Award from his Taft law firm. So that is, I know it's very special to him because few are given, and Rob received one. So that was today. That was a good thing. But today, Rob and his family, they continue to live in Cincinnati, where he continues as a partner for Taft. Please join me in welcoming Rob Bilott.
Morning. Thanks, Scott. Jack, thanks so much for coming out this morning to talk about forever chemicals. I know this was what everybody wanted to talk about as soon as they got up this morning. Talk about how we've got these man-made toxins in the blood of every person in this room, all of your children, your grandchildren, children that will be born from this point going forward, in every living creature on this planet. And the story of how this happened. How does something like this happen in the United States during our lifetime, modern times? How does it happen? Why does it happen? And how is it that it continues to this day? And how things are changeable. How individuals standing up, speaking out, are able to do incredible things. People like the farmer you heard Jack talk about in West Virginia, Wilbur Tennant, are able to take on some of the biggest powers that exist out there. One of the biggest chemical companies on the planet, the federal government, state agencies, and actually change things. The laws change. The science changes. So I'd like to tell you about that story, how this happens. How we can be in a place like where we're at today, where we've got these chemicals coursing through the blood of all of us and everything on this planet. You know, as Jack mentioned, I started my legal career back in 1990, fresh out of law school at Ohio State, had no idea what I wanted to do, had no technical background. I had gone to a small liberal arts college in Sarasota, studied political science, had no technical background whatsoever. But there was one course at the end of the 3 years that I thought, well, this seems kind of interesting. It was called environmental law. And so when I started at the firm at Taft in 1990, I noticed they had an environmental department. And I thought, well, that sounds great. I'll ask to join that group. And I did. I joined the environmental group in 1990. And at that point, I started learning about what is environmental law. What are our environmental laws? And for the next 8 years, I was slowly learning about the really complex system that exists in our country. You've got these very incredibly complicated, long, detailed federal statutes with hundreds and hundreds of pages of regulations telling you, here are the nasty, hazardous things out there. Here's the list of toxic, hazardous chemicals. Here's the rules that apply to those. If you're going to emit this stuff into the air, or if you're going to put it out into the water, or if you're going to make a landfill and put this stuff in it, here's the rules that apply. Here's the levels that are safe for those chemicals out in the environment. For the next 8 years, I started learning all of those, not just the federal laws, but all the 50 states and all the different local laws that applied in those cases. And most of the clients that our firm was representing at the time were big corporate clients. A lot of them were big chemical companies. I was helping those companies navigate this very complex world. And a lot of these rules were still coming out back then in the early 1990s. The US EPA didn't come into existence until 1970. A lot of these statutes started rolling out in the late 70s, early 80s. So when I started in 1990, a lot of this was still being fleshed out in the courts. What do these rules mean? What is all of this? How do you navigate through this? So I was working with big chemical companies, going all over the country, helping them figure out What was safe to emit into the air? What was safe to emit into the water? How do we set up a landfill? How do we regulate that? How do we get a permit that tells us here's what's allowed, here's what isn't? By 1998, I thought I knew that system fairly well. There were defined lists. And as long as you were going down that list, making sure that, okay, we're emitting this thing, here's the rule about how much we can put out into the air. Here's the rule, here's the standards. My entire perception of that world changed, though. October of 1998, when I got a phone call in my office. On the other end of the line, there was this gentleman who started, just right off the bat, rattling on about cows dying. And I needed to help him. And I was about to hang up that phone. This is not what I did. I didn't help people with cows. I mean, I was dealing with chemical, and I was wondering, how does this guy even get my phone number? Who is this? And right as about to hang up the phone, he blurts out, well, I got your name from your grandmother. So I paused and backed up a little and paid a little closer attention. I said, what? How did you get her name? And what he explained was he was raising cattle outside of Parkersburg, West Virginia. And when I heard that, I thought, oh, okay. Yeah, now I know the connection. My mom and her entire family grew up in Parkersburg. And as a kid, my dad was in the Air Force. He was stationed at Wright-Patt. We spent a lot of time, we traveled all over the place. But we would always come back to my mom's hometown for holidays, for birthdays. We'd go to Parkersburg. So I knew that town well. My grandmother still was out there at the time. And what he explained was his entire family raised cattle. That's all they did. They owned hundreds of acres outside of Parkersburg. And he was seeing white foaming water coming out of a landfill next to his property, flowed into a creek that his cows drank from. His cows were standing in this water, and over the last several years, he was watching these animals drop dead. They were developing tumors. Their teeth were turning black. They were wasting away no matter how much he fed them, and he was treating them the same way they had done for generations. These animals were dying. Calves were being born stillborn with deformed eyes, and he was convinced there's something, obviously, in this white foaming water coming out of the landfill next to my property that's killing these cows. But he was explaining that he had gone to the state EPA in West Virginia, he had called the federal EPA in West Virginia, and he'd even called the company that owned that landfill. He wasn't getting any answers. Nobody wanted to talk to him, particularly when they found out who owned that landfill. And he told me that was DuPont, the DuPont company. At the time, one of the world's largest chemical companies. They owned a massive manufacturing plant right down the road, and this was one of their landfills. It was a non-hazardous landfill, unlined landfill, that his family had sold to DuPont a decade earlier. And so when he would call the local folks saying, I've got this problem with the DuPont landfill, they didn't want to talk to him. Why? Because DuPont was one of the biggest employers in town at the time. Almost everyone worked there, or they had a family member that worked there. They knew somebody that worked there. Even the local lawyers that he was calling, when they heard DuPont, they didn't want to talk to him. So he had been talking to his neighbor one day, complaining about the fact that this is so obvious, but nobody will help me. Well, his neighbor had just been on the phone with my grandmother, who had been bragging that her grandson was an environmental lawyer, okay, in Cincinnati, and surely I would help him. So I hear this story, and I realize this is not what I do, all right? But I know landfills. I know this world. This is DuPont, after all. We didn't represent DuPont. Our firm represented lots of big chemical companies, but DuPont wasn't one of them. But I knew them because we were doing a lot of work under what they called the Superfund statute, hazardous waste sites all over the country. We would go there. I would be representing our chemical company clients. DuPont's lawyers would be there, and we would be negotiating who pays how much to clean these sites up. So I knew the DuPont lawyers, and I knew they know this world. They know these laws. If this is a DuPont landfill, and this is so obvious, certainly once they hear this, we can work something out. I should be able to help this guy. So I said, why don't you come up to Cincinnati and we'll take a look. So he and his wife drove up to our offices back October 1998, armed with photographs, videotapes. These were the days of VCRs, all right? So we wheel in our little portable TV, stick that VCR tape in, and it is mind-blowing watching these videos. This guy has been videoing for 5 years, and you can see the black teeth. He actually starts cutting open these animals on the video, doing his own autopsies because he can't get anybody to come in and talk to him about it. Those of you who've seen the films Jack mentioned, those actual videotapes are shown, not only in Dark Waters, but also in the documentary. So pretty graphic stuff. And so I'm looking at all of this and realizing this seems pretty obvious. You know, there's something in that white water that's killing these cows. But here was the problem, though. Our firm typically represented big companies, and we typically charged a fairly high rate by the hour. This family was not going to be able to afford that. No way. So luckily, the head of our environmental group, one of my partners now, Tom Turk, was walking down the hall when these folks were there, and I invited him in. He watched these videotapes. He saw these photographs. We talked a bit after watching all of this, and we realized we would have to take this case on a contingency, all right, where we wouldn't get paid unless we actually recovered something. We had never done that as a firm. So this was sort of a big leap. Not only that, this was going to be against a chemical company, DuPont. This would be bringing a case against a big chemical company. But we sat down, we looked at this, we thought, this is a straightforward, simple case. This is a small farm in West Virginia. This landfill, there's a clear issue there. We should be able to wrap this up pretty quickly. So we made the decision. This was sort of a turning point where we decided we'd take that case on a contingency fee. We'd help this farmer's family. After all, it was a family friend. So I started digging into this case in 1998. And these are the days before computer records, all right? And I start asking DuPont for their information about the landfill. Give me your permits. Give me everything that talks about what they did here. And of course, they said, sure, we'll give you all of our materials about the regulated hazardous materials in that landfill and our permits. So I'm getting all this, I'm pouring through all these. I don't see anything that's going to explain what's killing these cows. So yeah, some things maybe are a little off on what they're supposed to be at the levels in the landfill, but nothing would explain what is causing the white foam or why these animals are dropping dead. So everything's going along fine. DuPont's cooperating with us. Here's all these records. And I finally said, you know what? I want all of the records about what's going into that landfill, not just the hazardous regulated materials, but everything. Things changed. All of a sudden, oh no, you're on a wild fishing expedition. This is way out of control. Phone calls got made to my boss. He needs to back off. What's going on here? We had to go to court. We get court orders. They finally ordered us to start turning over these documents. I start pouring through hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. And again, those of you who've seen the film, these start coming in big boxes. That's the way it came back then. They weren't on computer disks. So I had to start going through all this paper, and I would sit down and just start organizing everything chronologically, because my brain works, I like to see things in a linear sense. So I start reviewing all these documents, and what I start seeing there really started blowing my mind. Because what I started reading was there was a chemical in this landfill that I had never heard of. In fact, massive quantities had been dumped there in the late 1980s, 7,000 tons. And so I'm reading through this, and it references something called PFOA. I had never heard of this stuff, had no idea what it was. I went to all of our references in our library to try to figure out there's no reference to this stuff anywhere. So I call some of our experts that we typically use for our corporate clients. Hey, have you heard of this stuff? One of the guys that we were working with said, I haven't heard of that, but I just saw something in the newspapers. Remember, this is spring now of 2000. I just saw something where the 3M company said they're going to stop making Scotchgard. And they referenced something about a chemical, but it was not PFOA, it was PFOS. They're going to pull that off the market. And if they're going to pull this chemical that sounds a lot like PFOA off the market. Maybe I ought to ask DuPont about that stuff. So I did. I started asking DuPont, give me all your documents about what this PFOA stuff is. More pushback, more fighting, more going to the court. We finally get those documents. I start reading through it. And what I start to realize is this is a chemical that is incredibly toxic, incredibly dangerous. The company has been using in massive quantities for decades, and it's in that landfill, and it's in the water leaking out in those cows. And what I started to see was, what is this stuff? And what I saw was the chemical had been invented by 3M right after World War II. Completely man-made, did not exist on the planet prior to World War II. And it had this unique chemistry of carbons attached to fluorine. I'm a liberal arts political science major. This was not making any sense to me, and I didn't care, I didn't understand what was the significance of that. Lots of expensive experts start helping educate me on what I was reading. And what they explained was this chemical bond, carbons to fluorine, which doesn't exist in nature, makes this chemical really strong. You can't break it apart. It made it really useful for lots of manufacturing processes. 3M started selling it to DuPont as early as 1951, and DuPont was using it to make Teflon. This big plant down in West Virginia that was sending waste to the landfill was the world's largest Teflon manufacturing facility. And DuPont had been using this stuff to make Teflon since the 50s. And remember, the US EPA didn't exist until 1970, so this is decades before there were federal agencies even out there looking at chemicals. But DuPont had some of the most sophisticated labs and scientists on the planet going back to the 1920s. Thousands of scientists, toxicologists, risk assessors. They were looking at this unique chemical in the early 50s and 60s when they started sending it down to West Virginia. Because of this unique chemistry, they started being concerned about what is this stuff going to do when it gets into the environment and gets into living things. Because after all, they were sending it to West Virginia, to this big plant, where it was being used in the manufacturing process. Some of it was going up the stacks into the air. Some of it was being discharged directly into the Ohio River. Other liquid solid wastes were being dumped into unlined pits all over the place, where it was going to seep into the ground or off to these landfills. So the DuPont scientists start studying this. When I'm reading all these internal documents, it's showing that by the 60s, they understood that it caused all kinds of toxic effects in laboratory animals. That when it would get out into the environment, it would never break down. You know, a lot of stuff gets out there, and over time, sunlight, whatever, it biodegrades and it goes away. These chemicals, when they got out into the world, would never break down. We hear referred to now, as Jack mentioned, as forever chemicals. That's why. When they get into the environment, if they get into the water and the soil, they will stay there. And in later years, we actually had some of the DuPont scientists explain this. Their breakdown is in geologic timescales. It would take millions of years for these chemicals to actually start to break down. They would be here after humans are off the planet, okay? So they started looking at, well, what does this stuff do when it gets into living things? So they started doing all these animal studies. Again, this is internal. In the DuPont lab in Delaware, they're doing all these tests. They're finding all these toxic effects. And then by the 1970s, they saw this stuff not only gets out and could have toxic effects in animals, it can get into people. By 1976, they had realized this stuff was getting into people who were exposed. And because it was this man-made, weird chemistry, our bodies didn't know how to break it down. So when it got in us, it stayed there. And unlike some chemicals that we just flush out, like my coffee, that caffeine, we'll get rid of it within a couple hours, this stuff would stay in us. And other things can maybe deposit to your fat or into a particular spot. This stuff bound to the blood and then circulated constantly throughout the body, coating all the organs. So it was incredibly toxic and persistent. Then they started monitoring the workers, testing the workers. 3M did and DuPont did to see how much of this is building up. What they were seeing is not only did it stay in the people, but it built up over time. It bioaccumulated. So by the 70s, they were aware it was toxic, bioaccumulative, and persistent. So DuPont starts getting concerned. Wait a minute, we're emitting this into the air, into the water. What if it's getting into the community? The medical director warns them. And again, these are documents I'm reading in all these files. There's great concern about potential exposure of the community. So DuPont goes out and starts collecting drinking water samples up and down the Ohio River in 1984. Has them analyzed by their own lab. What do they find? It's in the public drinking water in Ohio and West Virginia. Well, what's a safe level, right? So I'm looking at all this wondering, well, this stuff's incredibly toxic, and it seems to be, I'm not seeing any discussions with regulators or agencies about any of this. And what I realize is, because it predates the regulatory process, when the first federal regulations came out in 1976, regulating new chemicals coming out onto the market, it basically focused on new chemicals from that point forward. So existing chemicals like this that had already been out there since the 50s, and I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but the law essentially said it was up to the companies that were making or using those, if they had information suggesting a substantial risk to human health or the environment, it was up to them to self-report that to the EPA. And what I was seeing throughout all these documents is, despite all these studies and all of the stuff accumulating about the toxicity and the fact that it was in drinking water, the decision kept being made, we're not going to report it. At this point in time, Teflon sales were skyrocketing in the US. Okay, it was taking off. And this stuff was being used not just in pots and pans, but then in fast food wrappers, stain-resistant clothing and carpeting. This material was being, all kinds of markets were opening up. So I'm looking through all this. And then what really is disturbing is I see that the first cancer study is done in rats in the 1980s. Comes back, DuPont scientists look at it and say, it is a confirmed animal carcinogen. It causes testicular tumors in the rats. They start monitoring the workers. They start seeing increased cancer rates in the worker. So I'm reading all of this, and I'm wondering, okay, it's in the drinking water, and what's going on here? And so what I see is DuPont, when they start seeing that this is in the water, it's causing all these problems, that's when they dug up all this sludge around the plant, thinking that's what's leaking, because the drinking water wells happened to be right next door to the plant at the time, all right? So they were assuming it was leaking from these pits and getting into the water. That's when they dug all this stuff up. And where'd they take it? They dumped it right next to Mr. Tennett's property in the non-hazardous, unlined landfill because it's not regulated. And it wasn't regulated because none of the information had ever been provided to the agencies. So I'm looking at all of this, realizing, I think I know what's killing these cows, okay? And we even have memos where they're talking about what will this do to cows drinking it. Okay? So needless to say, we were able to settle the case for Mr. Tennant at that point and his family. And we could have stopped and gone away. But what I was seeing in those documents was incredibly disturbing, because what it showed me was this was a problem that was impacting not just Mr. Tennant and his cows. It was in the public drinking water of tens of thousands of people around that plant. Nobody knew about it. The regulators didn't know. The public hadn't been told. I may have been one of the only people on the planet outside the company that knew this. This was my hometown, the way I viewed it, being poisoned, and nobody was telling them. Mr. Tennant didn't want this just being covered up by a settlement and going away. So we struggled with, what do we do about this? And then I started seeing documents in the DuPont files where they actually sat down, and their own scientists, even though no regulators knew about it, so there were no standards about what's safe, what isn't safe. The DuPont scientists sat down in 1988 and said a safe level would be no more than 1 part per billion in drinking water. Now, to put that into perspective, I'll use DuPont's own analogy. That's 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So that gives you some idea of how concerned about the toxicity and persistence of this chemical the DuPont folks were. And by the way, at that point in time, that was about the lowest level you could even detect in water. And what I was seeing in the documents, DuPont sampling was showing the levels were 3 to 5 times that in the public water of tens of thousands of people, and nobody had been told. So I sat down and I discussed it with the firm. What do we do? This is a public health threat. We could stop and go away. I decided to put together a big letter, putting everything we had found in these documents, non-confidential, the company wasn't claiming confidentiality, put it together in a big letter, sent it to the US EPA and every agency I could think of. That was March 6, 2001, 20 years ago. And I told them, this stuff's in public water, it's a health threat, you need to come in and do something. At the time, I assumed that would take care of it, right? The agencies would come in, end of story, this would all be fixed. Spoiler alert, okay? Here we are in the year 2021. This chemical is still not regulated in the United States. That process is still going on. So when that data finally got revealed, the community found out, they came to us and said, we want this out of our water now, and we want to know what's it going to do to us in the long run. If it causes cancer, kills animals, what about us? We've been drinking it for decades. Well, we had a real problem at that point. Because it's one thing to take on a case for one family and one farmer. This was going to be a class action on behalf of the entire community, and a case where we were bringing a claim for a chemical that wasn't regulated. There was no, what were we going to cite to say, you're above this level? Luckily, we were dealing with West Virginia, which allowed some claims called medical monitoring, allowed you to bring claims for risk of harm. And what we decided to do was we agreed we would take this case. We would bring this class action. Why? Because it was a public health threat. We had this information, and we may be the only people that could do something about it. And I have to give our firm a lot of credit for taking that on at the time. This was not a popular thing to do, all right? But we had this information, and looking at what we saw in those internal documents, felt pretty convinced this was a serious threat. And what we pointed to was DuPont's own documents and their own scientists saying no more than 1 part per billion. We filed that case in 2001. DuPont immediately went to the state of West Virginia, where, by the way, their lawyers became the heads of the agency during this process. All right? It was a revolving door there at the time. They cut a deal with the state of West Virginia to come up with a government-approved safety number. Remember, they already had their own internal number. There was no new data. But they went to the state of West Virginia. They got the state of West Virginia right after our case was filed to come out and say 150 parts per billion is perfectly safe. So DuPont goes into our court and says this case needs to be thrown out. Government has spoken. Everything's safe. This all ends. Luckily, the judge said no. All right. This case can proceed under these claims. So we were able to proceed with our case. Years of litigation going by, and we dig more and more into these documents. And what we see is essentially the company's got all this data, animal studies showing harm, worker studies showing harm, but their key argument was always, but you can't show that the levels of the chemical in the drinking water of these people will actually cause them harm. There's no study that's been done of those people that show that. They weren't doing the study. How do you get that data? And as a lawyer, I knew we're the ones bringing these claims. We'd be the ones that have to go into court and prove that this chemical could actually cause them harm. I start funneling as much of this information as I can to the US EPA during this time period. The US EPA in 2003 starts looking at this and realizing this is a major problem. We may have to ban this chemical. They actually sued DuPont, which was pretty unprecedented at the time, saying that the company had withheld information about a public health threat. That if they had been given this information decades earlier, they might have been able to begin regulating this stuff a long time ago. But now they're having to play catch up. So they get sued by the EPA. The media, for the first time, picks up on this. A story airs on 2020, in 2003, talking about Teflon pans and potential cancer risk. It was right before Thanksgiving. So things aren't going well. That's when DuPont decides to settle, okay? In 2004, they settle our case in West Virginia. They also settle the EPA's case. They pay him a $16 million fine, the largest civil administrative penalty in the history of the EPA. DuPont was making billions of dollars off of this every year. So EPA basically went away. Because what DuPont also agreed to do was to stop making the chemical. They were going to phase it out. They were no longer, 3M had been making it, and had pulled out of the market in the meantime, DuPont had jumped in to start making it themselves. So they pay a fine, they say we're not going to make this anymore. By 2015, it will all be gone. And so by that point, they had decided we're out of the market, everything's gone away, the EPA went away, it looked like end of story, right? Our case is settled, DuPont pays for water filtration systems. But we also decided there was one thing that had been missing, was what does this do to people in the long term? So we agreed with DuPont, we would set up a panel of independent scientists. We had to really kind of think outside the box. We were going to step outside of this litigation process and deal with this issue of, can the chemical cause disease to the people drinking it at the levels they're actually exposed, at their dose level? Nobody had done this before. So we set up this panel called the C8 Science Panel. 3 independent scientists, both sides. We were able to actually agree on independent people that hadn't worked for either side before. They'd look at all the data, all the internal studies, and they'd do new studies of the impacted community. And their decision would be binding about whether this chemical could cause harm. If they said no, if they agreed with DuPont, end of story. Everything was over. If they said yes, there was a problem, the people who were impacted could get free medical testing, and they'd be able to go seek damages from DuPont. That was 2005. Again, nobody had done this. We weren't quite sure what would happen. DuPont also gave $70 million to settle the case. Rather than just cut checks to everybody and walk away and hope it worked out, we decided, let's use that money to do the study DuPont never wanted to do. Let's get a big enough study. Because even though human studies have been done on workers, DuPont kept saying, well, it's not big enough. You don't have a big enough sample size. It's not statistically significant. For cancers, which is what we were concerned about with this chemical, you need tens of thousands of people to find valid results. So we ended up using the $70 million to pay everybody in the community to come forward, have their blood drawn for the chemical, provide medical data. We weren't sure if anybody'd do this. We got 69,000 people in that community who came forward, gave their blood, ended up some of the biggest, most comprehensive human health studies ever done on any chemical were then done over the next 7 years. 2005, in 2012, they finished that work. In the meantime, everybody forgot about these chemicals. That one media coverage that had started just kind of went away. The EPA had gone away. Every time I kept sending letters to the EPA during this period of time, what are we doing about regulating this? Well, the science panel's working on this, okay? Let's see what the science says. In 2012, that panel confirmed drinking this chemical at the levels these people were drinking it could cause 6 diseases. One of them, remember the rat study? Testicular tumors? Testicular cancer, kidney cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, high cholesterol. When those diseases came out, the people in the community who had those were able to move forward and file claims against DuPont. We had 3,500 people file individual injury claims. Those cases started moving through. The first cases started getting teed up for trial. The first case finally goes to trial in 2015. In that case, DuPont was held liable for having caused the woman's cancer. Now, at this point, we thought we had been doing everything we could to get this information out to the public, to the agencies. Here we just had a 6-week trial where all of this history was laid out, all of the facts. A jury had agreed with us. This chemical caused a cancer in this woman, and that DuPont should be held responsible. The rest of the world still wasn't even aware this was happening. And what was also happening at the meantime, right before that case went to trial, DuPont, which had been around for 200 years, going back to the Revolutionary War, gunpowder, they started disappearing. Right before our case went to trial, they announced they're going to spin off their entire Teflon division into a completely new company called Chemours. Chemours would now own these sites and all these responsibilities. So when that verdict came out, what did we hear from DuPont? Well, that wasn't us. That's this other company, Chemours. Then they announced they're going to merge with Dow Chemical, and then they split into 3 new companies, and the assets game starts going on. So they're starting to go away while this is all finally coming. The rest of the world has no idea this is happening. And what had happened is once those links with disease came out, that finally triggered the US EPA to start looking for these chemicals in public water. They said, okay, there are these health effects. Now we have to decide, is this a nationwide problem? Or is this just a problem in West Virginia? Because we don't regulate chemicals in drinking water unless it's a national problem. So in 2013, for the first time, they started asking public water supplies all over the country to start sampling for not only PFOA, but that related PFOS Scotchgard chemical. All of that data starts rolling in. I'm looking at it as it goes into EPA. Nobody else is. That stuff's all over in drinking water all over the country. But because it's still unregulated, nobody's told about it. I'm trying to figure out, how do we move this to the next level here? We've done everything we can to get this public health threat information out. This stuff's all over the US. Nobody knows about it still. At that point, I was approached by Nathaniel Rich, who said he wanted to work on an article for the New York Times Magazine. I'm thinking, how can we get the public health threat information out? I agreed to be interviewed for that. That article came out in January of 2016, and things really changed from that point forward. It was a feature article in the New York Times Magazine, which was surprising to me. But it laid out this whole history, but most importantly, it pointed out these chemicals aren't just in West Virginia. They're being found in drinking water all over the United States. That was January of 2016. That was the first time people across the country started saying, oh, wait a minute. What's this stuff? Why is it in our water? What's the safe level? Suddenly you had governors, state senators, legislators calling US EPA, saying the same thing I'd been saying for 15 years. EPA, what's the safe level? 4 months later, US EPA came out with its very first drinking water guideline for the stuff in water, 70 parts per trillion. So tiny, infinitesimal amounts. That prompted testing all over the US, particularly by the Department of Defense. Because what we realized was these chemicals have been used not just in Teflon. As I mentioned, stain-resistant waterproof clothing, carpeting, anything that was waterproof or non-stick, but also firefighting foams. Aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, the stuff that you use to combat petroleum-based fires. So the stuff had been sprayed out all over the place, outside of military bases, airports, firehouses, all over the country. When the Department of Defense saw that new EPA guideline, they went out and started sampling hundreds of sites across the US. And what did they find? The stuff's in the drinking water. From that point forward, late 2016, early 2017, almost every day in this country, a new community is finding out these chemicals are in their water. Pressure starts building. For water providers all over the US are having to now put in filtration systems to deal with this. States are saying, we're not waiting any longer for US EPA to actually come up with an enforceable number. That number they came out in 2016 was just a guideline, because they're still in the process of evaluating whether or not to regulate this or not, okay? So states start moving forward, adopting more standards. More lawsuits get filed all over the United States. We now have thousands of lawsuits all over the country dealing with the fact these chemicals are in drinking water. A recent estimate estimated 200 million people in this country have these chemicals in their drinking water. It is in the blood of everyone. It's everywhere. It's not just the United States, it's in countries all over the world. Australia, Italy, New Zealand, Germany, every day. So when that article came out, Mark Ruffalo read that article and said, how is it that this is happening in the United States and nobody's heard of this? Why is this story in the New York Times Magazine not on the front page of the New York Times? So he said, I want to find a way to bring this out to a wider audience. This is an ongoing public health threat. So he asked, I want to do a movie. So again, my concern is, how do we get this out to the public? How do we bring this out? How do we get this information out? So we agreed. He teamed up with Participant Media, and they came here into Cincinnati, and we filmed Dark Waters, which was this whole story to try to show to people, this isn't just affecting a cow farmer in West Virginia. This isn't just affecting one community. This is a problem that affects all of us. This is how it happened, right? And this is what's going on with our regulatory system. That all of this would still be happening, except for a farmer saying, I want to fix this, and people having to go into court and get it done. None of this would have ever come out to the rest of the world. So I also thought, how else do we get this information out? Because congressional hearings were even beginning. And I would see representatives stand up from the company saying, despite these massive independent human health studies confirming links with disease, there's never been any scientific evidence showing any harm from these chemicals at any dose in any human anywhere. Just mind-blowing. So that's when I decided I'm going to do a book. And we're going to put this information in a book so it's available to people to see what is really known about these chemicals. And as we've seen this spread out, what we're coming to learn is this stuff, it's not just these PFOA and PFOS. This is an entire family of completely man-made chemicals. There are thousands of them out there. And as we're learning about all these other ones that are now out there, we're hearing the companies say exactly what DuPont said 20 years ago about PFOA. Well, you don't have any evidence showing that it's causing harm in people because the studies aren't being done. So I brought a new case in 2018 where I'm seeking to bring a class action on behalf of everyone in the country who has these chemicals in their blood. And the claim is not for money. It's if the companies that are making these and putting them out there are going to sit back and say, well, you, the exposed people, you have the burden to show this is hurting you, but we're not going to do the studies. And we're going to say it takes tens of thousands of people to do a big enough study to show the harm, knowing that those cost tens of millions or not more to do. The company should be ordered to pay to have the independent studies actually done, to tell us what they're doing. So that case is pending right now. So what's been incredibly encouraging is as the movie came out, as this book came out, a documentary, The Devil We Know, as Jack mentioned, also is available on Netflix. That came out. People all over the world started realizing this is happening. This needs to change. And what is incredibly encouraging to see is it can change. Because of this information finally getting out, we're seeing now people recommending changes at the state level. Laws are changing. These chemicals are being banned in certain products. Federal legislation is being proposed. The President of the United States got up and actually talked about needing to address these chemicals, something I thought I would never see happen. So it can happen. Change can happen. And as I sit back and look at this story, the thing that I think I want people to take away from this is realizing it pays to step out of your comfort zone, to take a risk. Somebody comes to you saying they need your help. It may not be what you're typically doing. It may not be your typical client base. But it's worth it to do that, to help the truth come out, to help make sure that people are protected, to use whatever skills you may have and find ways to do it differently. Know that you, as a lawyer, you can't just stick in the courtroom. You've got to find different ways to come out and address these things to help folks. So I've been incredibly fortunate to have the support of a firm like Taft, to be able to work in a community like this that was able to let us do this. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. I'd love to take some questions. I know I rambled on probably for way too long, but thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this morning. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks.
Yes. Are there any questions? Let's see. We'll take the microphone.
The question was, why did they turn over the documents? I think, I had done the defense side. I'd played that role in many, many times before. I think part of it was probably they didn't think anybody was actually going to read them. If we just dump, what they call that is a document dump, just dump tons of paper, nobody's going to take the time to sit down and actually read them, particularly when they're not organized. It was before the days of computer search and being able to search for things. You had to sit down and physically read each page. So I don't even know if their folks had done that at that point. So I think they just didn't expect that to happen.
Thank you for the excellent speech. The FDA has a clinical trial process to make sure things are safe before we ingest them. EPA has no such thing. Is there any onus on anybody who manufactures anything to make sure that what they're manufacturing is actually safe for humans?
You raise an excellent point, and one of the reasons I did the book was to try to point out this. I think most of the public just assumes, when we turn our tap on, of course somebody's out there making sure whatever is out there is safe before it can get into our water. There is a very different regulatory process between things that are considered drugs or food, things that we purposely put into our body. A lot of those rules require a lot of testing and proof that it's safe for humans, and you actually have to show what's the safe dose before it comes out. It's very different if you're exposed to something that will get into you, like these chemicals. It's the same as if somebody went up and injected you with this stuff. You put it out there, it's going to get into people. But if you're exposed to something because of the environment, in environmental exposure, very different rules apply. Essentially, it's up to the exposed person to prove that that thing is going to cause them harm. The law I mentioned that came out in the late 70s, the Toxic Substances Control Act, sets out all kinds of provisions. It's supposed to require a lot of testing up front before chemicals can come out into the environment. Again, that only focused on the newer chemicals going forward. Most of what we're talking about today are chemicals that predated that were sort of grandfathered in, that were already out there. There's hundreds of thousands of those that nobody's ever really gone back to look at. And what's troubling is you think, we only found out about this because of cows dying in West Virginia. What else is out there like this that escaped that entire regulatory process? So this story has prompted folks to call for changes in the way we regulate chemicals. In fact, that law was updated in 2016. This was cited as an example of why we needed to beef up those rules. It's still in process. It's a slow process.
Are there any studies looking at what these chemicals are doing to our bodies, how to get them out of our bodies, number one? And number two, any studies looking at the impact it's having on plants and trees, the environment?
Yes, unfortunately, these chemicals are taken up through the roots of certain plants. They get into crops, and historically, this stuff has made its way through wastewater treatment systems where it gets made into sludge. And a lot of wastewater plants over the years have given away biosludge as fertilizer over the years. We're now realizing that stuff is like liquid concentrated PFAS in a lot of cases. And so it's been found to now be contaminating agricultural fields and getting into the foods and such. Unfortunately, there's really no easy way to get it out of you. All right? There are certain drugs that have very high side effects. And one of the real concerns now, particularly as the pandemic was hitting, this research is showing the real concern people are having with these chemicals right now is their impact on our immune system. They can decrease the effectiveness of our immune system, and most troubling, decrease the effectiveness of vaccines. That's why as the pandemic was unfolding, I realized it was more important than ever to try to get this story out. Here are chemicals in our water, in our blood, that may be impairing our immune system and decreasing vaccine response while we're dealing with a pandemic. Why aren't we talking about this? So researchers, luckily, doctors, scientists all over the planet right now are looking at the very issue you raised. How do we deal with that being in people? How do we get rid of it? Nobody's really come up with a good answer yet.
Thank you for all of your hard work and countless hours, paid or unpaid. But so you answered one of my questions about the COVID, but how does the fluorine versus fluoride, I'm not a scientist, so how does that work? Because I know that even our water systems, they add fluoride to our water. So what are those differences and what can we do? I know there are pending cases all over about fluoride, but how are these different and similar?
I preface my response by reminding you I'm a political science, but my understanding from my experts, so we had to pay a lot of money to educate me, is there's essentially two types of fluoride-related materials. There's inorganic fluorine, and apparently that's the kind that's put into water for fluoridation, for tooth strength, that kind of thing. The stuff we're talking about is an organic fluorine. It's fluorine attached to carbon. That makes it organic. And that's the stuff that doesn't exist naturally anywhere. That's the stuff that's very problematic. And that's the key characteristic that all chemicals in this PFAS family, these thousands of chemicals, they all share that carbon, fluorine, organic fluorine bond. So two different things, although they sound alike.
Okay, last question.
Good morning. Thank
Morning.
you for all of your work. Since your grandmother was very pivotal in launching your career, did she or that farmer ever live long enough to be able to see what came of this work?
Unfortunately, Mr. Tennant ended up contracting cancer and died in 2009 while we were waiting for the science panel to confirm whether it was linked with disease or not. His wife also then died of cancer. So unfortunately, they didn't live to see the fact of this story coming out and the health effects being confirmed. It's also one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about trying to find a way to get their story out, and why I wanted to make sure that that family was prominently featured as the focus in the film, to show what they went through to get the story out. And unfortunately, my grandmother passed away in 2009 as well. But I think they would be proud to know the story is out. I keep hearing over all these years in the back of my mind, and those of you who've seen the film and you see Mr. Tennant, you can hear his voice in the back saying, people need to hear this. People need to know this, and once they see it, it'll be so obvious that we need to do something. So we're almost there. I think we're finally getting to the point where something's going to be done. It takes a long time, but it can happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. We just love to hear about the story and Bob's passion and Taft Law Center and their staff, and just the passion and also the notes, reminders of being a president-elect. Like he said, sometimes things are not always lined up and what your responsibilities will be. Sometimes we have to deviate a little bit to address the concerns, and that's exactly what you did, Bob, and thank you so much. Let's give him another round of applause.